All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad khatam al-Nabiyyin. Mattaba'u bi ihsani yawmiddin. So inshallah, the next 45 minutes, we'll go over some basics of project management. This YPM101 class is typically a 6-hour class. We do 3 hours hands-on activity, woven into it another 3 hours of lecture and instruction. It's like 15 minutes each. Because of COVID, we're doing it digitally. Usually we do it on site with some hands-on activities, and it's a full day with lunch and pretty cool thing. So we'll cover just a piece of that class. We're going to focus on the concept of a project and then kind of some concepts to get you guys started on some of your projects here at ILIA, inshallah. All right, so let's keep this interactive. If you have questions, just jump in, unmute yourself, ask the question, or put it in the chat. But if you speak up, it'll be easier for me because I only have one screen here, so it might be difficult to see the chat. So what are we going to cover? We're going to just focus on what is project management, just this piece, and we'll learn one tool only today called WBS, Work Breakdown Structure. And we'll talk about how we use that tool at ILIA, the 3 different levels of a WBS, inshallah. All right, so try to scan this and see if it works for you. I don't know if it's still active, but you can scan this and tell us what do you want to learn today. That would help also make sure if we don't address your questions, in the next 45 minutes, we can address it offline, inshallah, in one of the Good Morning Ilias or, in one of our meetings. All right, so you can QR code this and fill it out. Okay.
The code is disabled.
It's disabled? Okay, then, yeah, we need to do a new one. No problem. All right. So projects are obviously something that has been going on for ages. The whole science of project management is relatively new. It started about 60 to 70 years ago, around World War I and II, when the world needed to organize how to do things, right? And the Industrial Revolution happened, and we started embarking on projects, things that we start to, to do in order to accomplish a specific goal. But now with COVID, the world is going through another major disruption, and we are still yet to see how the world is gonna, how things were gonna unfold after COVID is over. But just like we had different disrupting triggers in the past, like the internet, that kicked in around the early 90s, and it made a major change in the way people communicate with each other. And then shortly after email, you started having web servers pop up, and that made another disruption, and so on. So right now, it's more about mobile working, mobile everything, remote, virtual learning, virtual work, virtual telehealth, things like that. And that is imposing the need for more projects across the globe because the workplace has changed. There's more digital transformation, which means digitizing the way we do things in our life. So instead of going to the doctor today, physically getting into your car and sitting in the waiting room and waiting for your turn, and then the doctor doing the checkup, your annual checkup, you can actually do that today from home. You can just pick up your phone or go to a link that's secure. Your doctor will come up in a camera, just like we're, communicating now. He's gonna ask you a bunch of questions. The doctor can even send the patient, in some cases, remote monitoring devices that the patient can actually use, like a thermometer or a monitor to put on the body that sends bio information back to the doctor, and they can basically do their examination that way. So that's an example of digital transformation where the clinical encounter is being digitized today. You don't have to anymore go and travel and see your doctor. You can do this digitally. There's a lot of new enhancements and advancements in healthcare when it comes to things like that. Social engagement, the way people are engaging with each other. We're seeing tools like Zoom and others and Google Meet add new functionality to address as close as possible real life situations. So breakout rooms, things like that, virtual animations. There are new platforms that can give you the similar experience of a real conference where you have a theater, you have a ballroom, you have multiple classrooms, and people can move from one place to another and so on. So very, very similar to the real life experience. The idea today, because again, we're in a global pandemic and we need to get things done quickly, come up with some innovation, even if it's imperfect. And we've seen that with the vaccination. In about less than a year, about 9 months, we got 3-4 companies with approved vaccines out there that are being, shipped across the globe. And there's probably another 2-3 dozen companies working on vaccines, or they have vaccines that are still in the queue for approval. They're not 100% foolproof, but they have good rates in the 90s of protecting people, and some have in the 70s, but they have other advantages, that if people get sick, they don't get too sick that they need to go to the hospital, or they might even pass away. So the idea today is innovate even if you're not perfect, which means do projects. When you see the word innovate, you see the word change or new or novel. These are projects, because projects address new things. Collaboration is becoming more important than ever. It's going to take on different forms, new things we haven't even thought about. Artificial intelligence has become more utilized today than a couple of years ago. Artificial intelligence is not new. It's been around since the 80s, but machine learning and deep learning have become more utilized in the past 4 or 5 years with different types of technologies and social engagement and things of that nature. So basically, project management is becoming more and more important, and it's becoming a skill that the average graduate today is expected to have. 10, 15, 20 years ago, or actually 30 years ago, it was expected that a college graduate would know how to use a word processor and a spreadsheet. Back in the day, the most powerful word processor was called WordPerfect. It actually came out before Microsoft Word, and it was a very powerful tool. And it was expected that a graduate from a 4-year university would know how to use it, especially if they're in a STEM field. If they're in science, biology, engineering, they would know these types of tools. And then 15 years later, in the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, it's expected that a graduate would know how to do a web page. Today, it's expected that most of the population can do these things, and a technical savvy person like a college graduate would know how to do more advanced things like managing a project, managing a group of people, having some leadership skills, maybe writing some code, solving a problem using software and things of that nature. Even if they're not in the STEM field, the expectation is that a graduate from a university would know how to use a tool to solve a problem using software. Even if they don't write the code themselves, they're using pre-packaged code, drag and drop and things like that. So project management is one of these things that's becoming increasingly important. You see some examples of types of projects. Some could be mega projects or what we call giga projects, like huge power plants. Here's an example of a hospital for COVID that was set up. China set up a hospital, 10,000 bed hospital in 9 days when COVID kicked in December in China. I mean, that was unheard of. 10,000 beds in less than 2 weeks. And then they set up another hospital, 40,000 beds, I think in a week or so. But here's an example of a hospital. You got production lines. Tesla's got this huge gigafactory in China. So projects come in all sizes and forms. You can have a small project, 2 people working on it for a couple of weeks to achieve a certain goal, and they close it and move on. All right, so people who don't have what we call the non-knowledge workers will be left behind in the next 5 to 6 years. These are jobs or occupations that don't use knowledge. They use more motor skills, things like that. These will be jobs that are replaced by machines, by robots, by artificial intelligence, or the combination of both. An example are drivers. We're seeing today companies already replacing human drivers with self-driven cars, and it's being deployed in different parts of the country. All right, so what is a project? You could put this in the chat. In your thought, when someone tells you I'm working on a project, what comes to mind? What does that mean to you? So if you guys want to drop in the chat, what does that mean to you, a project? All right, let's make this interactive. I know some of you took this class just 3 weeks ago, so.
So what I think a project is basically a type of goal that has like really like complex steps to complete.
Okay.
That's what I think a project is.
All right, good. So a set of steps that complex, which means the outcome of these steps is not known without putting all the unit steps together and observing the total. So that's a good definition. Sarah here says working on initiative to achieve some sort of productivity. Okay. A set of tasks with a defined start and end date, producing a novel result, right? So it is a set of steps to achieve productivity, but it's usually novel productivity, something new, a new service, a new product, a new goal, and it has a start and end date, right? That's what differentiates it from an operation where they're usually continuous, they're perpetual, like a fast food chain or an airline. These are operations, you know, they check in passengers the same day every day in the airplane. They load their bags the same way, you know, there's nothing new here. But if the airline decides to replace the baggage handlers who are human beings with robots, that would be a project because it's a new type of service. It's a new operation that's being deployed. But once it's deployed and these robots, you know, move around the airport and they start moving the bags, it becomes a daily operation, right? So at some point, your project will move over to an operation. So the definition of a project, it's something that is temporary. It's temporary. It has a start and end date, and it has a unique goal, a very unique, you know, objective of achieving. And we got some examples of projects here on the screen. So I'm not going to go through this just for the sake of time, but you can obviously, you know, get an idea. All right, so some common characteristics across projects. If you guys want to get in the chat, just tell us from these pictures, what do you guess a project, any project, regardless how big or small it is or whatever industry it is, what would it include? Include collaboration, yep. So team of people, as you can see here on the left, there's people working together. And those of you who've been working on projects, I think is everyone on the call, you're working with someone, you don't do everything yourself, right? So that's the first characteristic, is that there's going to be a team of people. If you find one day you're working by yourself and on a project, that's an alert that something is wrong. Either you are no longer working on a project or your team is just not there. You need to bring people to make it happen. Hard work. Yeah, it could be hard work because there's a lot of new things in it, right? When we're dealing with new things, we don't necessarily know how to deal with it or what to expect next. So it could be hard. Some projects are simple and easy. They just might have a different variation of something we've done in the past, so we're not totally sure how the outcome would look like. Strategy, yeah, which means looking at the big picture, right? So strategy also involves how to handle risk. So you see that chessboard, that's more about risk. Remember, projects deal with new things, which means we don't know how they're going to work, if they'll work or not, how would they behave under different conditions. So it's a little bit risky. And that's another attribute of a project. Operations typically don't have high risk. We've done them before. We know how to do them. We have a manual on how to do it. We repeat it every, you know, week, month, year, whatever. So it has some low risk, but projects are things that are kind of new. You know, a new car model, is it going to sell or not? A new iPhone model, how will people get to use it? A new type of software, a new school in a new neighborhood. You know, those types of things are projects and they could include some risk. And then the last thing here is these natural resources. Projects have finite resources, whether it's time that people can put into it or, you know, supplies and material or money to fund that project. All right, so these are common characteristics. So one, teams. Two, you have limited resources, finite resources. There's risk, there's unknowns. And then the last thing, there's a need for planning. These people sitting around the table, there's a need for planning, which is basically your map to get from point A to point B. And you need to monitor that map using dashboards and analytics and tracking things. Analytics is another very exciting field. There's a lot of work in the area of analytics. And companies that are data-driven companies are the ones, again, who can grow and competitive and be competitive in their fields. Alhamdulillah, one of the reasons Ilya was successful last year is because we were a bit data-driven. We had over 4 or 5 dashboards, and we were looking at them constantly, and we had a lot of project managers tracking things and so forth. So when you're more data-driven, you're very focused, you can measure things and you can figure out how well you're really doing. And that's a big part of being successful. All right, so we're gonna touch real quick on just management in general, regardless what type of management. There are 4 cornerstones for managing something, whether it's a hospital, a building, a soccer team, a school. It doesn't matter what you're managing, but there's 4 things that a good manager needs to know how to do. The first one is to plan, is planning. What does planning mean? It means to come up with a map, like I said earlier, a sequence of steps to do something to achieve your net result. So you want to, let's say, travel to some destination. How do I get there, right? I take Highway 1 and then I get on Highway 2, and then, there's going to be a local road for 5 miles, and I turn left, and then I drive on another big highway for 100 miles, and there I am at my destination, right? So that map is basically your plan. We call it, in the world of business and work, we call it a plan. And it identifies not just the steps, but also other things like dependencies. So if I'm traveling to Chicago and all of a sudden it starts to snow, I'm now dependent on the weather conditions. I'm gonna have to slow down a bit. I can't drive, at 70 miles an hour on the highway anymore. I'm gonna have to slow down to 45 because of visibility, because I might, the car might slid or whatever. So we call these dependencies, right? So the plan tells you what to do, but there could be some dependencies in your project. You might be dependent on another project, right? So maybe you are, let's say, Abdul Latif, and you're trying to do a fundraiser activity or campaign to 10 donors, but you're dependent on the technology team to set up, a web page for you, or you're dependent on finance to calculate certain things so that you can use it in your promotion. So that's one part of your planning, is dependencies. So the first part is activities, second part is dependencies. The third part is risks. Remember, projects deal with unknown things. So if you are, let's say, Noreen, and you are reaching out to talk to a new group of people that we haven't dealt with before, there could be some risks there. We don't know how they're thinking. We don't know what they expect. Do they ramble too much and talk too much that they're going to waste the meeting time and we won't get to talk about what really matters? Or are they very organized people? Are they very easygoing, or they're very, complicated and difficult people? So that's the risk, right? So your plan would include the activities. It would include your dependencies, what you depend on, and number 3, your risks. These are the 3 key things that you'd see in your plan, right? And then there will be more details that we'll talk about later, inshallah. The other thing that managers do besides planning is organizing things. So they could be organizing their team members, just like, you're playing a group sport. The coach would tell different players where to be positioned in the field. So you're going to be offense, you're going to be defense, you're going to be the goalie. You guys will sit on the bench. We're going to need your help later when your peers get tired. We'll rotate and things like that. So they organize, meaning they structure how things would work. So you could be a manager of a hospital. You're going to organize your doctors and your nurses and figure out who works where, which floor. Or you can organize your supplies, your stock for medicine and inventory. Or you can organize how your pharmaceutical companies bring you medicine and sell it to you. So organizing is basically setting rules, setting standards. Just like, for example, Ahmed just set up a form assembly for us yesterday or the day before, so we can be organized in capturing our project accomplishments, right? So we're all capturing in the same way, so it becomes easy for all of us to understand the same language, the same thing. So organizing is basically putting a structure together and connecting the different parts in a way that makes sense. coming up with a standard. The third thing that managers do, which is directing, they direct people to a certain vision. Just like, looking at that picture there with the mountains, you're directing your team's focus to, all right, guys, look at the center of the image at that top peak of the mountain where there's no snow. That's where we want to land, right? So you direct them to the goal, you direct them to the objective. So I have a goal of collecting 400 contacts for 400 Islamic schools tomorrow. I gather my team and I let them focus on that, right? We don't get distracted by something else. So direction, the way a manager provides direction is through aligning them to a vision, is to explain the purpose, the mission, why are we doing what we're doing, to motivate them, to kind of positively influence them so that they can get the common goal achieved. And then the last thing that managers do, again, any manager, is to control things. So remember, the plan is your map. But how do you know that you're actually still driving on the way to Chicago and you're not ending up going to Florida? Is by comparing the street signs to your map, to your GPS, right? If you find the GPS say, turn left and you went right, and you're seeing different street signs, then you know that you've deviated from your plan, from your map. And this is exactly what control is about. So now you have a plan, a set of activities, and these activities have start and end dates. A week later, you're going to look at these start and end dates and say, are we there yet? Did we pass those dates or not? If we pass those dates, then our activities should be completed. If they're not, then we know that we're a little behind. And that's how you control things. So control is basically comparing your actual situation to your plan. So that actual situation could be actual money spent, actual activities completed. It could be actual dates. It could be, whatever it is that your project is doing. So these are 4 common cornerstones of management. Any management role that you might be doing one day, you should be doing these 4 things. When it comes to project management, there are 2 extra things. One, which is kicking off a project. So we call it initiation. And the other one is to close the project, because remember, projects are temporary, but management is a perpetual thing that happens all the time. And this can be applied also to households, right? If you're a parent, you need to plan for your family, when your kids go to sleep, what they eat, when they go to school, your budget, things like that. You need to organize your household, right? And you need to direct your family to what needs to be happening this week, and then again, control things. All right, so quick here tip. You can also put this in the chat. Who focuses on a project financial scope? The product manager or the project manager? This is kind of a quiz question here because we didn't talk too much about that. So the financial scope of the project, how many dollars and pennies did the project spend? Who is responsible for that? So Ahmed says the project manager. Anyone agrees with that? So first, let's talk about product manager versus project manager, right? So let's say you are working on a project to, let's say, help Ilyas Geralhoud get out of jail, right? That's your project. But what's the product here? The product is someone's release from jail. So the product, the end product that you're trying to achieve, is basically someone being released, right? A release statement, a judge saying, yep, you're good to go. That's the product. But the project is all the work that needs to happen to get to that point. Another example of a project could be to compile 300 names of Islamic schools across the country. So what's the product here? The product is the list of names of schools. That's the product. But the project is all the work that has to happen in order for us to get that list, right? And it requires deadlines and people to do it and meetings and all kinds of things. So when it comes to projects like these, the person responsible for the financials is the project manager, right? Now the product manager might say, I have a budget of $200, $1,000, whatever it is, In project manager, I need you to manage that budget. So the project manager manages it for the product manager, but the product manager would be the one giving the money to the project. All right. Okay, so let's talk about this diagram here. Basically what it's saying, it's showing us a flow of ideas. So you start with some problem on the left side. You break that problem to a solution, and you take that solution, break it down to some items, like a to-do list, right? So the problem is schools or Muslim kids have difficult times and they need some support, all right? That's the problem. So we give them a crisis line. But how are they going to know about the crisis line? So the solution is, let's reach out to these youth through their schools. So the project here is to take 300 school contacts, put them into Salesforce, have a group of people write a nice email with a picture, have someone put up an open house on a website, and we then promote all this to the schools. So what I just explained is our work items, our to-do list. Someone has to create a web page. Zafar has to do an agenda. Mahmoud has to create the web page. Jannah will create the Eventbrite. Alawi will set up a date. He will track it in Salesforce. Then, I have to send out the persona and so on, right? So these are just random work items. We call it a to-do list, just like going to the grocery store saying, I need to buy 10 items, milk, bread, crackers, cheese, meat, shrimp, whatever. They're just a random list of things. But then when you walk into the store, you start to group these things, right? You don't go to aisle 1 and then 7 and then back to 2 and then back to 9 and then 1 again. You try to go get everything from aisle 1, then you go to aisle 2, get everything you need from there, and 3 and 4 and whatnot. So basically you're taking that random list into a more organized, and this is where organization comes into the picture, a more organized list, which has start and end points. In the case of the grocery store, your start and end points are the aisles. I'm going to go to aisle 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll spend 5 minutes in each one. So after 30 minutes, I've done the whole store. In the case of a project, you're going to say, all right, the web page has to be first, then the video goes on top of it, and then we put the date, and then we create a section, then we send the email. So there's a sequence. When we start thinking about sequencing, they become activities because they have start and end dates. They have dependencies. I can't, send an email to people if the web page is not up. Well, where am I going to put the video? It's got to sit somewhere, right? Where would the agenda be hosted? So it's got to be on the web page. So that sequencing becomes now what we call a list of activities. When you start to do these activities that are very specific, measurable, attainable, they can be done, they're not crazy ideas, they're relevant to the problem at hand, and they have a start and end date, they're time bound. So if we're trying to promote a crisis line to 10,000 youth in 300 schools, we have to be specific, meaning, what are we doing here? We're promoting it to schools. We're very specific. We're not promoting it to any organization. We're not just picking a random list of 10,000 organizations and sending them the email. That would be a disaster. But we're sending it to only schools because the email will be carved out to talk to a school principal. Dear principal, your middle schoolers and high schoolers go through 1, 2, 3, and hence they need this. Now, if that email comes to the plumber who comes to our building, they're not going to make any sense of it. They're going to trash it. So you need to be specific. Measurable. We know we're sending it to 300 schools. Why is that important? We don't just send it to any random number because so we can expect what results will happen. General rule of thumb, for example, is every 10 emails, only one person will open it up. So if I'm sending it to 300, we know that 30 people will open up their message. And out of the 30, probably 4 or 3 would sign up. Again, 1 to 10, maybe 1 to 5 if they're more engaging people, right? So if 30 people open it up, I'll get 6 signups at most. These are my results. So now I have an expectation what to expect once my project is close to being finished is I expect 6 schools to respond And if each school has 50 students, that's 300 youth who knew about the crisis line. And if out of 300 youth, 1 out of 100 call once a week, that's 300 extra calls a week, right? These are the outcomes, which means 300, people, 3 people stabilized or whatever every week. And now I can have an impact on the bigger community. All right, so that's kind of the flow of things. And you want to be thinking about this from the get-go. As a project manager, you're asked to manage Bobby's case or to come up with 300 schools or whatever it is. You want to ask the question, why? That's what we call strategic thinking. Why do we need 300 schools? Because we're trying to address problem X, Y, Z. Oh, I see. Okay. And what are we doing with these 300 names? We're going to send it this way. So now you understand what the results would look like. That's also important so that you focus on what really matters. Does the zip code of the school matter so much, or the email matters? If we're going to be sending emails, if the activity is to send emails, then the email is more important. So rather than worrying about which zip code is the school located at, I can spend extra time to make sure the email address is accurate and is correct. All right. So this picture kind of gives you a high-level understanding of how things go from a very ambiguous state, a state that we don't know much about. It's a new project, something we don't fully understand. We understand there's a problem out there, but we don't know how to tackle it, to something that's very clear in our head, right? That we're going to have at the end of the day, 3 people each week calling us for the next 14 weeks until we remind these schools about ourselves again, and we continue to get another 3. But maybe this time it's not just 3, it's 3 plus 2 from the first batch of communication. And that's how you grow. All right, so for projects to be successful, you need to focus on work. You always need to know, how is your team doing? What did we accomplish today? What did we accomplish this week? So you want to have a schedule that you meet, and you want to track your expenses. At Ilya, we don't track expenses that much yet. It's something Ahmed will be working on, in the background, trying to come up with estimates. How many hours does each person spend on a project? And he can come up with costs for that, if we buy supplies and material. But that's important so that we can continue doing this good work. Otherwise, at some point, we'll run out of resources. And you want to be able to deliver capabilities. What does that mean? That means if I, in that example, again, the youth crisis line here, we collected the names and we put it into Salesforce, we've accomplished something. Our database has increased, even though we have not sent out the email yet. There's some value in that, right? Now you sent the email, there's more value. Now that people start to respond, there's even more value. Now that people are calling the crisis line, there's a lot more exponential value, right? There's always deliverables being achieved. And as you can see, moving from the left to the right, you have some deliverables that will be realized. All right, so again, as you get started with a project, always ask these questions. What is the problem that we're trying to solve here? And write it down, right? So Bobby's case, the problem here is a wrongfully incarcerated person is robbed from his life behind bars. That's the problem, all right? What do we need to do? We call that needs analysis. Well, we need to increase visibility. We need to get him support. We need to have a good lawyer defend him. We need to shake, the governor's office a bit. We need to get community momentum behind it, all right? And then we start to define the value of these things and understand who are the people that we need to involve in this type of project. Well, the general public is one. So I need to reach out to reporters of newspapers and find an exciting story. I need to put stuff on Instagram. I can get a lot of youth, find 4, 5, 6 youth who have 3,000, 4,000 followers and just have them post a couple of things, that show empathy with this case. Now, all of a sudden you got 20, 30,000 people who know about it, right? People who are liking it. And once that happens, you have a spark that kind of grows. And that same concept, you can apply it across every other project. So who are the stakeholders that will help this project meet its goals, all right? And then you start to think about different points of view. If this project has to do with the example we gave Bobby, in his case, how do we see this from an operational point of view? Like what would happen on a typical day? So typical day, there's a change.org page that's up. People are going to it, putting, comments, sharing, maybe there's letters to some editor once a week, going to some newspaper. That's a view, right? So you're having some picture in a mental image in your mind about what this project would look like. So these are activities that you can do at the beginning of the project to set what we talked about earlier, the direction, right? And that would help your team follow through that direction. Okay, so moving on a little bit, this is the last thing we'll talk about today, is a work breakdown structure. Now, very shortly after you start your project, you're starting with a blank, slate, a empty sheet of paper or Google spreadsheet. You don't even know what to put on it. So you come up with some random points. These random points then become headers, and under each header will be details of tasks that you will be working on, right? So the best way to not be overwhelmed is to start with a blank sheet of paper, put these random ideas, just like sticky notes, and each sticky note then branches into more details. Here's an example of a random idea. Someone comes to you and says, hey, we need to upgrade our network at Iliad. What do we do? I don't know, I'm not a network guy. All right, so you give it some thought. You say, all right, we probably need to install some stuff. I don't know what it is, but I'll put a yellow sticky note, call it installation. We probably need to remove some old stuff. Even if there's no old equipment, we got to run cables or install a modem or something. We're going to have at least empty bags, packages to throw away. So we're going to remove some stuff. We need to test it. And then we need to turn it over to the person who's going to use it, right? So we'll go to the person managing the building and say, hey, here's your manual to how to use the network. Again, I'm not a network guy. I don't know much about networks, but I just know from common sense that these are the things that need to happen. Now, what if your project is a little more complicated? Then you need what we call a product manager, right? So I'm managing Bobby's case. I'm managing the Islamic school crisis line outreach, but I don't know anything about Islamic schools. I don't know anything about crisis line. I don't know anything about outreach. So who do I go to? I go to the product manager. The product manager, in the case of the crisis line, would be Zafar. Hey, Zafar, tell us more about this crisis line. What does it do? Well, we handle up to 40 different types of cases: homelessness, abuse, unemployment, this, and that. So now you're getting an idea. Oh, so maybe I break down my project by those categories. What else does the crisis line do, Zafar? Well, it answers calls and it does referrals. Oh, so maybe instead of breaking it down by the 40 things the crisis line handles, I break it down by the way it works, that it either stabilizes or it refers. So maybe that's how I break it down. So I could take any project that's ambiguous in my mind and break it down by one of two ways: either the way we do work or by the end product. So in the case of this classroom example, we're breaking it down by the way we do work, which is to install, to remove, to test, to turn over. And then I'm taking each one of these, like this turnover box, and blowing up into more boxes. I could also have done the same example a different way. Instead of install, remove, test, turnover, I could have said routers, cables, screws, manuals. And then for each one of them, I would think about the installation, the configuration, the testing, and the turnover. Either way is fine. Whatever makes more sense is what you want to do. So this is a very powerful tool. We always recommend that we use a Google Sheet to do a WBS. I'll show you guys what the template looks like, and then we can pause for questions, and you can practice this on your projects, inshallah. So I'm going to switch over here to Google. You just go to New on Google Drive. You click Google Sheet. You click on this little arrow. Click on From a Template. And it's going to open up a bunch of files. You choose the one that's called Project Plan Workbook. That's a Google spreadsheet that has multiple tabs in it. You're going to choose the tab that's called WBS. details, this one here, and it shows you an example of how to put one together. In this example here, we use a spreadsheet rather than a picture like the other image here that you guys were looking at, just because it's easier and quicker. So if I were to do this classroom, I would say here, installation. Number 2 would be, what was number 2? Removal. Number 3 would be testing. And number 4 would be turnover. All right. You open now a new spreadsheet. You want to save it in the proper folder on your Google Drive. So you just go here and, click move and move it to wherever you need. But in this case, 5, 6, and 7 are extra. So I'm going to delete these. And I'll just start to put subtasks. We have these small columns just to help with indenting, so it looks nice and organized. So installing, I could say install main router. And then there could be subtasks like, configure first interface, something like that. Configure local area network interface. So one is the wide area, one is the local, whatever. All right, and then here, maybe connect computer, test printer. So you see how, you're doing the installation. And there could be a subtask 2. Now I installed the main router. Number 2 could be install the rack that the router would sit in. All right, maybe there's no number 3, so we'll take this out. Now, obviously you need to install the rack first before the router, right? So sometimes it makes sense to move this to the top. It doesn't matter. But then this is an example of a dependency. So the router, the rack, would happen here. So hypothetically speaking on August 1st, but the router itself cannot happen till that's done, let's say 2 days later, over here. I'm going to give this 2 days, and I'll take this out, this yellow stuff. All right, so now I understand that this has to happen first, then this. After I configure the first interface, I could do the next one. And there's 2 sub things I have to do part of this, which might be these 2. So they happen at the same time, right? So this is the flow of activities. Basically, there's a dependency here. And I can only remove the junk that's remaining, the boxes that are empty and the plastic wraps and all that stuff after all of this is done. So I'm just going to copy this and put it here. So this has to happen at the end. And I have to test before I move everything, because in case, I miss something, I need to look for a manual that I lost in the box or whatever. So I'm going to do the testing here. And then last thing is to turn it over to the client. I go and say, all right, client, it's ready for you. Come, look at your new network in your new classroom. All right, so you start with this activity, row 8. You go here, then you do 5, 6, 7. Then you do your testing. You remove the extra stuff you don't need, and you turn it over to your client. If you want to reorganize them, move things that happen first at the top, that's fine, but it doesn't really matter. You get the point, but that's how you do your schedule. And this is basically here, your WBS. So I would recommend that you all start working on WBSs for your project so that it gives you a very good idea of what you're working on. And every day that passes by in your project, you will come back and add more steps, right? So if you're managing our Flash halaqah, for example, you can go back here and say, oh, what I need to do is Zoom, check recording settings, or add co-host. And as you learn more things, you add more to this. At some point, this spreadsheet could be 200, 300 rows big. And that's a really good reference document. When your project is over, you can turn it over to someone else and say, all right, it's done. You now run it and take care of it while I go work on a new project. All right, so that's kind of what we're covering today. I'll pause here, see if any questions from anyone. If not, we can go around real quick and just share what key things you learned today. So we can start from the top here. Let's start with Ahmed.